My family spent years calling me the problem child. Then my brother finally moved out. I found the shattered vase behind my bedroom door when I was 11 years old. And by the time my mother finished screaming at me, I still hadn't said a single word in my own defense, because I'd already learned that defending myself only made things worse. That's the part nobody understands when I tell this story now. They think I'm going to say I fought back, that I stood in the kitchen with my hands on my hips and told my family exactly what they'd gotten wrong about me. I didn't. Not for 18 years. I stood there and took it, the way I'd been taking it since before I could tie my own shoes, because somewhere very early on I'd absorbed the lesson that in the Whitfield house there was one broken thing, and it was always going to be me. My brother Mike is 2 years older than me. He was, by every account except mine, a golden child in the most literal sense. Blonde hair that curled at his temples, a smile with a dimple that made waitresses give him extra fries, a laugh that filled up a room. My mother, Linda, used to say Mike walked into the world already knowing how to charm it. What she never said out loud, but which I understood in my bones the way you understand the temperature of a room, was that I had walked into the world already being blamed for it. The vase wasn't the first thing. It wasn't even close to the first thing. But it's the one I remember most clearly because it's the one where I actually watched Mike do it. I was standing in the hallway when he threw a football through the living room, an indoor football which should tell you everything you need to know about the wisdom of teenage boys. And the vase, my grandmother's cut glass vase that sat on the entryway table, went down in a spray of glass that looked, for one suspended second, almost pretty in the light. Mike's face went white. Then he looked at me, and something shifted behind his eyes, quick and calculating in a way that 13-year-olds shouldn't be capable of, and he said, "Sarah, why would you throw the ball in the house?" I didn't even process what was happening fast enough to correct him before my mother came around the corner. Once she saw the broken glass in Mike's face, stricken, apologetic, already halfway to crying, and my face, which I imagine was doing the thing it always did when I was accused of something, going still and flat because some part of me had already resigned itself to not being believed, the verdict was in before I opened my mouth. "Sarah Elizabeth Whitfield." My mother's voice had a particular register she reserved just for me, not for Mike, never for Mike. "That was your grandmother's vase." Don't you dare lie to me on top of it. Here is the thing I want you to understand, because it matters for everything that comes after. I was not a well-behaved child pretending to be troubled. I actually was, by most objective measures, a difficult kid. I had a temper. I slammed doors. I said cruel things when I was hurt, the kind of surgical cruelty that comes easily to smart kids who have figured out exactly where people are soft. I got suspended once in 8th grade for shoving a girl who'd been spreading rumors about me, and I have never pretended that was justified, even though it felt righteous at the time. I am not telling you this story because I was innocent. I'm telling you this story because I was guilty of plenty, and it still didn't matter, because whatever I was actually guilty of got buried under everything I wasn't guilty of, until the two became indistinguishable in my family's collective memory, until Sarah and the problem were the same word in our house. Mike's transgressions had a way of evaporating. He totaled my mother's car at 17, driving drunk from a party he wasn't supposed to be at. And within a month, the story in our family had softened into kids make mistakes, and thank God he's okay. When I got a C in algebra the same year, my father sat me down for a 40-minute conversation about focus and discipline and throwing my future away. I want to be fair to my father, David. No, that's not right. My father's name is Robert. Everyone calls him Bob. Because for a long time I told myself he was just tired, just checked out, just letting my mother run the show because it was easier than fighting her on it. I've had to let go of that story in the last few years. A person who watches unfairness happen in front of him for 2 decades and says nothing is not neutral. He made a choice over and over to let it happen because it cost him less than intervening would have. That's not tired. That's a decision, repeated until it becomes a personality. By the time I was 17, I had stopped trying to correct the record in real time because correcting the record never worked and only extended the punishment. If I said that wasn't me, the conversation didn't end. It escalated into a second offense, lying, which somehow always felt worse to my mother than whatever I was being accused of in the first place. So I learned to just absorb it. Nod. Say I was sorry even when I hadn't done anything, because an apology closed the conversation in 9 minutes and a denial kept it open for 40. I want to tell you this made me a doormat, but that's not quite true either, and this is the part where I have to be honest about the person I actually was, not the person that makes the better story. Because underneath the absorbing and the nodding, I was building something. I didn't call it that at the time. I called it keeping my head down. But what I was actually doing, starting around 16, was watching, cataloging. I started noticing patterns in how Mike operated, the specific tells he had when he was about to lie, the way he'd get overly detailed about something he hadn't actually done in order to seem more credible, the way he'd cry on command, real tears, a skill I have never in my life been able to fake. And I started without fully admitting to myself why, keeping a folder. It began as nothing. A photo of a text message Mike sent me admitting he'd borrowed $60 from Mom's purse and asking me not to say anything. I saved it, screenshotted it, and emailed it to myself, actually, because this was back when texting wasn't backed up anywhere reliable. Not because I had a plan, but because some cold, patient part of me had decided that one day evidence might matter. I didn't use it. Mom found out about the $60 a different way a week later. She found the receipt for a video game Mike had bought, not a present for me. And Mike, without missing a beat, told her he'd taken the money to buy me a birthday present and had been planning to surprise me, and that the video game was a separate thing he'd paid for with his own allowance. It was a lie so audacious it looped back around to being almost admirable, the kind of thing you'd want to applaud if it weren't aimed at burying you. She believed him. She actually thanked him for thinking of me. I sat there with proof in my email account that I said nothing about, because what was the point? And because some early, self-preserving part of me had already run the math on what it would cost to correct the story versus what it would cost to just let it stand. It would have been my word plus a screenshot against a boy performing love for his sister in front of an audience who wanted to believe him. That's the version of me I have to own up to now, 12 years later. I wasn't collecting evidence to protect myself in the moment. I was collecting it because some part of me already knew I was never going to be able to defend myself in real time, and I wanted someday a reckoning. I wanted a receipt. I think if I'm honest, by the time I was in college, the folder had stopped being about protecting myself and had become about revenge, dressed up as documentation. I'm not proud of that. But I also won't pretend it isn't true. College was the first real relief I'd had. I went to a state school 4 hours away, which was as far as my parents would fund, and for 4 years I got to be a person who wasn't automatically the suspect. My roommate freshman year, a girl named Priya, once said something to me that knocked the wind out of me. She said, "You flinch when things break." I hadn't known I did that. I started paying attention after she said it, and she was right. A dropped plate in the dining hall, a car backfiring, a door slamming somewhere down the hall. My whole body would brace, waiting for the accusation that, for the first time in my life, never came because nobody in that dining hall knew or cared that I was Sarah Whitfield, the one who broke things. I went home less and less. I picked up a part-time job at a campus bookstore partly because I liked it and partly because it gave me a legitimate excuse to skip a Thanksgiving or a random weekend visit without having to explain myself. My mother would call on Sunday evenings and ask when I was coming home next, and I got good at vague answers. Midterms, work schedules, a friend's birthday. True things stacked up to build a wall that wasn't technically a lie about any single brick. Holidays became obligations I dreaded for weeks in advance. Mike, meanwhile, had dropped out of his first college after 2 semesters. Too much partying, not enough class attendance. A story that in most families would have triggered some serious conversations about consequences, and moved back in with my parents at 20 to save money and figure things out. He stayed in that house in his childhood bedroom for the next 9 years. I want to slow down here because those 9 years are the real spine of this story, and they're the part people always want to skip to the ending too fast. Mike, at 23, got a girl pregnant and didn't marry her. The baby, my nephew Eli, ended up primarily with his mother, a woman named Courtney who my family, I'm ashamed to say, mostly treated as an inconvenience rather than the mother of their grandchild. Mike paid inconsistent child support when he paid it at all, and my parents covered the gaps without ever framing it as covering for him. It was always helping out with the baby, never bailing out Mike. He got fired from 3 separate jobs in 4 years, each time for a different reason that was, according to Mike, always someone else's fault. A manager with a grudge, a coworker who lied about him, an employer who just didn't get his work style. My mother repeated these explanations at every family dinner like she was reading from a press release, and I would sit there, 30 minutes from my own apartment by then, watching my father nod along and feel something in my chest go very quiet and very cold. Here's a specific night I still think about. I was 26. We were at my parents' house for my mother's birthday, and Mike showed up 2 hours late, visibly hungover, and knocked over a glass of red wine onto the cream carpet my mother had professionally cleaned the week before for the occasion. The room went silent in that particular way rooms go silent when everyone is waiting to see how bad it's going to be. My mother, who once made me cry for 45 minutes over a broken vase I didn't break, looked at the wine soaking into her carpet and said, "Oh, don't worry about it, honey, accidents happen." She got up and got a towel. She apologized to Mike for not having a rug there in the first place, like the carpet had personally set a trap for him. I remember looking at my father to see if he'd say anything. He didn't. He was refilling his own wine glass. I didn't say anything either. That's the part I have to sit with. I had every right in that moment to say something, to point out the vase, to point out 18 years of a double standard so blatant it should have been visible from space. I didn't. I sat there with my jaw tight and my hands flat on my thighs, and I went home that night and added the memory to the folder, which by then wasn't really a folder of screenshots anymore. It was a mental ledger. I was keeping score, and I was keeping it because some part of me had decided that someday I would need it. Someday there would be a moment where the score would matter. And until then, my job was just to survive family gatherings without breaking. My father and I had a relationship, for most of my 20s, that I would describe as cordial but hollow. He'd ask about my job. I work in logistics coordination for a regional shipping company, which is not glamorous but pays well, and which I am, genuinely, good at. And he'd nod through my answers without much follow-up. And then he'd ask if I'd talked to Mike lately, and there was always an undertone to that question. A suggestion that whatever distance existed between me and my brother was a problem I was responsible for solving. I remember once, at 25, trying to bridge that hollowness on purpose. I drove up on a random Saturday, no occasion, just me and him, because I'd read some article about adult children and distant fathers and decided I wanted to try. We sat on the back porch and he told me about a project from his old job at the plant, a machine he'd spent a week troubleshooting decades earlier. And for about 20 minutes it was easy, almost good. The kind of easy I used to watch him have with Mike and assume I simply wasn't built for. Then my mother came out with iced tea and mentioned in passing that Mike had called that morning asking to borrow the truck, and I watched my father's whole posture change, lean forward, engaged, already reaching for his phone to text Mike back. The porch conversation didn't resume. I sat there another 10 minutes finishing my tea and then drove home, and I didn't try that again for a long time. I dated a man named Tyler for 3 years during this stretch, and Tyler was the first person outside my college friends to really watch my family operate up close, at a Thanksgiving dinner when I was 27. Mike showed up an hour late again. Punctuality was never his strong suit, not that it ever cost him anything, and made a joke at my expense about how I'd always been the dramatic one, a joke that got a laugh from my mother and a tight smile from my father. And Tyler, in the car afterward, was quiet for a long time before he said, "I don't think I've ever seen a family talk about one kid like that in front of them. Talk about me like what? Like you're a problem to be managed. Your brother just spilled a drink on your mom's coat, and everyone laughed it off in about 4 seconds. You asked your dad to pass the potatoes a little too fast, and your mom made a comment about your tone." I hadn't clocked the potatoes thing, honestly, because by then it was so background-level normal to me that it didn't even register as data. Tyler noticing it, an outsider noticing it within one dinner, cracked something open in me that I hadn't let myself feel in years, which was just how insane the whole architecture of my family actually was. Not sad. Insane, structurally, deliberately unfair, in a way that had somehow become invisible to everyone living inside it except me. Tyler and I broke up 2 years later, for reasons that had nothing to do with my family, though I'll admit that some of what he'd named that Thanksgiving had already started reshaping how I moved through my parents' house. I stopped absorbing quite so automatically. I started very carefully saying things like, "Actually, that's not what happened," in a flat, unemotional voice, and watching my mother's face do a small flinch of surprise, like a dog that's used to a leash suddenly finding no resistance on the other end. The moment that actually broke things open, though, the moment that ends this part of the story and gets us to the part everyone actually wants to hear, happened when I was 29, 2 years ago now. Mike, at 31, was still living in my parents' house. He had, over the prior year, run up almost $11,000 in debt on 2 credit cards my parents didn't know he had. Cards he'd opened using an address that used to be theirs from before they moved, meaning the statements went to a P.O. box he controlled, and my parents never saw a trace of it. He'd also, I found out later, been telling my parents for months that he had a plan, that he was saving to move out, that he'd found an apartment and was just waiting on a security deposit, a story that kept shifting in small ways every time someone asked for details. What actually happened is that a collections agency called my parents' house. Mike wasn't there. My mother answered, heard the words "your son" and "past due" and $11,000, and something in her, for the first time in my entire life, cracked. She called me that night, crying in a way I genuinely never heard from her before, not the performative upset she did over broken vases, but something raw and frightened. And I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it's not what a better person would have felt. I felt vindicated. I felt, God help me, almost gleeful underneath the part of me that was concerned about my mother's distress. 29 years of ledger-keeping had built up a pressure in me that I didn't fully understand until it found release, and the release felt like a held breath finally let go. I didn't say any of that to her, obviously. I said the right things. I asked if she was okay. I asked what she needed. And then, because the moment had finally arrived, the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for since I was 11 years old standing over broken glass, I said, "Mom, there's some stuff you should probably know about Mike. I've known about some of it for a while. I didn't say anything because I didn't think you'd believe me over him." I'm not going to pretend that sentence was purely generous. Part of me wanted her to feel exactly how it felt to not be believed by someone you'd trusted your whole life. Part of me wanted her to sit with that discomfort the way I'd sat with it for 2 decades. I told her about the $60 from when we were kids. I told her about a few other things I'd cataloged over the years. A missing watch of my father's that Mike had pawned and blamed on a break-in that never happened. A car accident in his mid-20s he'd claimed was someone else's fault when I'd actually seen the insurance report naming him at fault, because he'd once left it out on the kitchen counter, and I'd photographed it out of some instinct I couldn't name at the time. My mother went quiet on the phone for a long time. And she said, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" And this is the question I still don't have a fully honest answer to, because there are two true things sitting next to each other, and I don't know which one is more true. The generous answer is that I tried as a kid and got punished for it, and learned that telling the truth about Mike cost me more than staying silent did. The less generous answer is that somewhere along the way, staying silent stopped being self-protection and became strategy. I wanted, on some level I wasn't proud of, for this exact moment to happen, for the evidence to matter all at once, dramatically, rather than trickling out uselessly over the years. I let my mother keep believing a false version of her son for longer than I needed to, because some wounded part of me wanted her to feel the full weight of it eventually, all at once, instead of in manageable pieces. I told her the truth about that actually a few weeks later, when she asked me again. I said, "Some of it is that I didn't think you'd believe me, and some of it honestly is that I stopped trying to convince you of anything a long time ago, and I'm still figuring out how I feel about that." She didn't have a response to that. I don't think she'd ever considered that her favoritism had a cost beyond Mike's debt. The debt situation forced a reckoning that 11 years of my complaints never had. My parents sat Mike down. My mother told me about this conversation later since I wasn't there, and for the first time in his adult life, told him he had 6 months to have a real plan, a real job, and his own place, or they were done covering for him. He was furious. He accused my mother of turning on him, of listening to Sarah's lies, which I'll admit stung in a specific old way, hearing that even now at the moment of actual accountability, I was still cast as the manipulator rather than the person who'd finally told the truth. But something had shifted that couldn't fully unshift. My mother, for the first time, didn't fully buy it. She told him, according to her own account to me, "Sarah didn't make up a police report with your name on it, Michael." He moved out 4 months later, into a small apartment across town, paid for mostly by a job he actually kept for once. A sales position at a car dealership that suited his particular gift for charm better than anything he'd tried before. And here is the part of the story that I think surprises people the most, the part that doesn't fit the tidy revenge narrative shape. Nothing was magically fixed once he left. My mother didn't apologize to me, not really, not in the direct way I used to fantasize about as a kid. What I got instead was smaller and stranger, a kind of quiet recalibration. She started texting me more. She asked my opinion on things she used to just tell me. Once at a dinner about 8 months after Mike moved out, she caught herself mid-sentence saying something faintly critical of a decision I'd made about a work project and stopped and said, "I don't actually know what I'm talking about, do I? You're good at your job." It was such a small sentence. It shouldn't have meant anything. I went to the bathroom and cried for 10 minutes. My father and I still haven't really talked about any of it. That's the honest, unresolved part of this story. He was in the room for all of it, the vase, the wine on the carpet, 20 years of it, and he has never once brought it up, never apologized, never acknowledged that he stood by. I asked my mother once if she thought he even understood what he'd let happen, and she said, quietly, "I think some people would rather not look at something than have to feel bad about it." I don't know if that's an excuse or an accurate diagnosis. Maybe both. I tried once about a year after Mike moved out to say something to my father directly. We were alone in the kitchen, my mother out running an errand, and I said as evenly as I could manage, "Dad, did you ever notice how differently you and Mom treated me and Mike growing up?" He was quiet for a second too long, long enough that I thought maybe, finally, we were going to have the conversation I'd been waiting 20 years for. Then he said, "You were always tougher. You could handle more." He went back to the newspaper. I understood in that moment that he had built a version of the past where his unevenness wasn't unfairness. It was a compliment, a vote of confidence in my resilience, and that version was never going to move. I didn't push further. Some doors, I've learned, don't open no matter how long you stand there knocking. You just have to decide how much of your life you're willing to spend on the porch. Mike and I are not close. We're not enemies either, which surprises people. We see each other at holidays. He's better now, genuinely, steadier job, a girlfriend who seems to keep him more accountable than my parents ever did, more present with Eli than he used to be. I don't hate him. I think Mike was, in his own way, as trapped by the role my parents built for him as I was trapped by mine. Golden children don't build themselves. Somebody hands them the gold. What I've had to make peace with is that I'm not entirely the wronged party in the tidy way I want to be. In the version of this story, I used to tell myself at 2 in the morning when I was 22. I let my mother stay in the dark about things I could have told her, for reasons that were partly self-protective and partly, if I'm honest, punitive. I wanted her to hurt eventually, in one clean cut, the way 20 years of small cuts had hurt me. I got that. Doesn't feel as clean as I thought it would. What I do know is that I don't flinch when things break anymore. Priya was right all those years ago that I used to. I tested it a few months back, dropped a coffee mug on my own kitchen floor on purpose just to see. It shattered loud. Nobody came running to blame me. Nobody came at all. I just got the broom. If there's one thing I've learned from stories like mine, it's that the lie doesn't have to be dramatic to do permanent damage. Sometimes it's not even really a lie, exactly. It's an omission, a half-truth someone lets you believe because the truth is inconvenient for them. That's actually a lighter version of what happened to a friend of mine, a guy I met through a support group a while back, whose entire relationship with his father got poisoned over a single sentence his brother said once that he never bothered to correct.